You're standing in a room that belongs to waiting. It smells faintly of damp paper and cold stone, the kind of place where time settles rather than passes. A single light hums above, not flickering, just present, steady enough to forget, persistent enough to notice. The table is worn smooth by repetition. Its surface carries small scars where documents have been read, corrected, and read again. A jug sits untouched. A cup has cooled. A pencil lies aligned with the table's edge, placed carefully, as if order itself might soften what follows. Somewhere beyond the door, movement shifts and then stills. Nothing is said. Nothing needs to be. You are not here for confrontation. You are here to remain. Before we move on, take a moment to subscribe. Only if quiet histories shaped by patience and restraint are the ones you return to. And if you're listening from somewhere still, let us know where that is, or which detail has remained with you. You're listening to echoes of war. A woman stands still, long enough for the room to forget her. She does not move with the confidence of arrival, nor the restlessness of departure, but with the practiced restraint of someone accustomed to being evaluated. Her posture is careful, her breathing quiet, her presence reduced to what is necessary to remain visible without inviting attention. In this space, attention is not a gift, it is a risk. The room is quiet in a way that feels supervised. Light presses in through tall windows, softened by dust that never quite settles, and the air carries the dry patience of paper that has been handled too many times. Somewhere nearby, a clock measures the seconds with a dull insistence, each tick landing without emphasis, without urgency, as if time itself has been trained to wait. You notice how the silence is not empty, but organized, shaped by walls that have learned to listen. The war is already underway, but it does not announce itself here. There are no sirens, no distant thunder of guns, only the soft friction of documents passing from hand to hand and the faint scrape of a chair pulled closer to a desk. Decisions are made without voices rising, without faces changing, and the consequences of those decisions drift outward, slow and irreversible. This is how conflict begins for many, without sound, without movement, without permission to be dramatic. You can feel how the room has trained itself to refuse. Refusal does not arrive as a single word, but as a sequence of pauses, a request deferred, a requirement added, another form to complete. Each delay feels reasonable on its own. Together, they create a weight that settles into the body, teaching patience through repetition. She waits, and in the waiting, something else forms. Not resolve, not anger, but a narrower awareness of what space she occupies and how easily it can be taken away. The war, still distant in sound, is already close in method, pressing inward through systems that mistake order for safety. The waiting stretches, not outward, but inward. It settles into the muscles of the back, the careful placement of hands, the decision to stand rather than sit. In rooms like this, movement is interpreted before it is understood. Even stillness has a posture. The war, when it finally arrives, will feel loud by comparison, but this is where its habits are learned. Outside, life continues in smaller motions. Shoes pass along stone corridors. Doors open and close with polite finality. Somewhere, a clerk clears a throat, as if preparing to speak, then does not. The atmosphere teaches a lesson without instruction. Survival begins by accepting that permission is not evenly distributed. It must be requested, justified, delayed, and sometimes withdrawn without explanation. She becomes fluent in this language of restraint. Each form completed, each interview endured, each silence absorbed without protest adds to a private understanding of systems that do not see individuals, only categories. In such systems, the body becomes an argument. The past becomes an inconvenience. Difference becomes something to be explained away, or quietly excluded. You notice how the room never changes, yet the person within it does. Not in visible ways. There is no dramatic shift, no moment of declaration. Instead, a subtle recalibration takes place. Attention narrows. Expectations lower. Persistence replaces hope, not as a virtue, but as a method. This is how one learns to exist inside refusal without being erased by it. When she finally leaves, the room remains exactly as it was. The clock continues its measured work. The papers wait for the next set of hands. The war moves forward without acknowledging this small exchange, yet it carries its shape with it, orderly, impersonal, convinced of its own neutrality. Offices that do not move. The days begin to resemble one another. Morning light enters the same windows at the same angle, catching on the same corners of desks, illuminating the same stacks of paper waiting to be disturbed. Even the dust seems familiar, settled into patterns that suggest nothing important has happened overnight. In places like this, continuity is a form of reassurance. She returns because returning is required. Absence would be noted more quickly than persistence. Each visit reinforces the appearance of normal procedure, even as the underlying questions remain unresolved. The system prefers this rhythm, requests circulating without conclusion, decisions held in suspension long enough to feel permanent. You sense how the building shapes behavior without instruction. Voices soften upon entry. Gestures become economical. The body learns which movements draw attention and which dissolve into the background. Over time, this knowledge settles into muscle memory. Adaptation happens quietly, without the need for resolve. When refusals come, they are rarely explicit. More often, they arrive disguised as concern. There are reasons, always reasonable. Policies invoked without authors. Standards applied without explanation. Each justification carries the calm authority of process, and each one places responsibility back onto the individual. If progress stalls, it is because something has not yet been satisfied. The repetition wears down expectation. Hope, when it appears, does so briefly, cautiously, like light reflected off glass rather than shining directly. What replaces it is something narrower and more durable, a focus on procedure, on the next step rather than the outcome. Survival in this space depends on learning how to persist without expecting recognition. She adjusts her language. Certain details are emphasized, others omitted, not to deceive, but to align. Alignment is rewarded here, even when it changes nothing. The act of fitting becomes its own measure of success. Each interaction teaches where the margins lie. You notice how fatigue accumulates not through exertion, but through restraint. The effort required to remain composed, to wait without demanding, to listen without reacting. This exhaustion leaves no visible mark, yet it alters posture, breath, patience. It is the cost of remaining eligible. Eventually, the process yields something that resembles permission. Not an opening, but a narrowing, an allowance contingent on further compliance. The building releases her in stages, never all at once. Each concession feels provisional, subject to revision. She steps back into the street again, carrying with her the habits the place has taught. The war remains distant in sound, but its logic is already familiar. It is a logic of systems that do not move, and of individuals who must learn how to move around them. The spaces change, but the atmosphere follows. New rooms, different desks, unfamiliar faces, yet the same measured calm settles over everything, as if carried from one building to the next. Papers are exchanged, introductions repeated, expectations clarified and revised. The war expands, and with it the machinery designed to regulate who may participate and how. She is present now not as a request, but as a candidate. The distinction matters. A candidate can be assessed, compared, ranked. Stillness is replaced by evaluation, but the rhythm remains slow, deliberate. Questions circle rather than advance. Each one tests not only knowledge, but tolerance for delay. You notice how credentials behave differently here. They are acknowledged, then set aside. Experience is noted, then qualified. Each achievement seems to lose weight the moment it is spoken, as though gravity operates differently inside institutional walls. Nothing is dismissed outright. Nothing is accepted fully. Training rooms smell faintly of chalk and oil. Maps lie flat on tables, their edges curled from repeated use. Instructors speak with practiced neutrality, careful not to promise more than the system can deliver. Instruction proceeds in fragments, techniques demonstrated, then postponed. Information arrives without context, as if completeness itself might be dangerous. She absorbs what is offered without pressing for more. Observation becomes the primary skill. Who speaks freely? Who hesitates? Which rules are enforced strictly? Which bend under pressure? These details matter more than the material itself. They reveal how authority functions when certainty is scarce. Fatigue begins to take on a different texture. No longer the exhaustion of waiting, but of continual adjustment. Each environment demands a recalibration of behavior, tone, expectation. The body adapts, but slowly, carrying the residue of previous rooms into the next. The war is teaching its participants how to endure uncertainty as a constant. Outside, events accelerate. News arrives unevenly, carried by rumor as often as by report. Victories and losses blur together, stripped of detail by distance. Inside, the pace remains unchanged. Preparation continues as if time were abundant, as if conditions might stabilize if studied long enough. You sense how the contradiction settles in. Urgency exists everywhere except where decisions are made. This gap creates a pressure that has nowhere to go. It accumulates quietly, turning patience into habit, habit into expectation. When she moves on, it is not because the process is complete, but because it has shifted. The next stage presents itself not as progress, but as continuation. Credentials are gathered up, carried forward, already beginning to thin at the edges from use. The war waits. The system waits. And within that shared waiting, a different kind of readiness takes shape, one that does not depend on approval, but on endurance. Credentials that wear thin. Time passes without ceremony. Weeks mark themselves through small changes. The angle of sunlight on the walls, the weight of coats hanging near doorways, the tone of conversations that grow fractionally sharper. Training continues in measured intervals, never hurried, never fully settled. What is learned feels provisional, as though subject to recall. She is issued materials that must be returned, instructions that must not be repeated. Authority arrives in fragments, distributed carefully to avoid imbalance. Trust is implied, but never stated. Each allowance is conditional, resting on continued compliance with rules that remain partly unspoken. You notice how the environment rewards restraint. Those who ask fewer questions move more smoothly. Those who adapt quickly remain longer. Confidence expressed too openly invites correction. In this way, behavior is shaped not by discipline, but by subtle pressure toward conformity. The body becomes an object of quiet scrutiny. Movement is assessed. Endurance noted without comment. Limitations acknowledged only when they complicate procedure. There is no hostility here, only an unspoken preference for what fits cleanly within existing forms. Anything that does not fit must justify itself repeatedly. Fatigue deepens, settling into the joints, the lower back, the spaces behind the eyes. It is not the fatigue of exertion, but of vigilance, maintaining composure across environments that never quite resolve. Sleep comes, but lightly, interrupted by the need to remain ready for instruction that may arrive or vanish without warning. Outside the training rooms, the war presses closer. Borders shift. Alliances strain. Reports arrive stripped of emotion, reduced to data points that resist interpretation. Yet inside, the routine holds. Maps are adjusted. Procedures refined. The distance between preparation and application widens. She learns that readiness is not a moment, but a state. One sustained through repetition rather than clarity. Each day spent in this suspended condition reinforces the lesson that participation is always contingent, never guaranteed. One can be prepared and still be excluded. When the system finally moves, it does so with little explanation. A posting is suggested, then confirmed. Conditions are attached, then revised. There is no sense of culmination, only of transition. The machinery releases her not because it has resolved its doubts, but because delay has become inefficient. You feel how the passage out of these rooms carries the same ambiguity as the entry. Credentials remain, but their authority has worn thin. What replaces them is not certainty, but familiarity with constraint. The war opens slightly, just enough to admit another presence. What lies ahead is not clarity, but exposure. The habits learned here, restraint, observation, endurance, will soon be tested beyond the safety of walls that do not move. Ordinary streets under watch. The streets appear unchanged at first. Shop fronts open and close at familiar hours. Bicycles lean against stone walls, their paint worn thin by weather rather than conflict. The rhythm of footsteps remains steady, guided by habits formed long before uniforms became common. If you did not listen carefully, you might mistake this for continuity. She moves through these streets without haste. Her pace matches those around her, calibrated to avoid distinction. Bags are carried lightly. Corners are taken wide. Nothing about her suggests urgency. In places like this, urgency attracts attention faster than purpose. The occupation announces itself in details rather than declarations. Notices affixed to walls. Flags hanging where none hung before. The language of authority replacing what once felt communal. Patrols pass without hurry, their presence normalized through repetition. Each encounter feels unremarkable, which is precisely its power. You notice how observation becomes constant, not focused, not intense, but distributed across every sense. Reflections in windows. Footsteps that echo too closely. Conversations that pause when unfamiliar ears approach. The mind learns to register these signals without reacting, storing them for later, when stillness allows evaluation. She returns to the same streets again and again, not because there is nothing else, but because familiarity offers camouflage. Repetition becomes protection. Each successful crossing reinforces the illusion of belonging. The body learns where to slow, where to linger, where to disappear briefly without raising suspicion. Inside cafes and small rooms, voices remain low. Information travels sideways, passed through gestures, glances, incomplete sentences. No one asks direct questions. Directness has become a liability. Instead, meaning accumulates through pattern. Who arrives late, who leaves early, who no longer appears at all. Fatigue begins to assert itself differently here. Not as exhaustion, but as tension held without release. Muscles remain slightly engaged even at rest. Sleep, when it comes, carries the residue of alertness. Dreams replay ordinary scenes, stripped of safety. The war presses inward through the ordinary. It does not disrupt routines so much as occupy them, layering pressure onto movements that once required no thought. The result is a kind of double awareness, performing normality while monitoring its fragility. She adjusts continuously. Routes change subtly. Associations shift. What was safe yesterday becomes questionable today. Nothing fails all at once. Instead, the environment tightens incrementally, teaching caution through near misses that leave no record. You sense how survival here depends on remaining unremarkable. To be noticed is to invite interpretation. To be interpreted is to lose control over one's presence. The streets reward those who move through them as if nothing has changed. Yet everything has changed. The streets remember. Each return carries the weight of previous crossings, successful or otherwise. The war does not interrupt daily life. It inhabits it, quietly, persistently, waiting for attention to lapse. Over time, the streets begin to feel smaller. Not because their geography has changed, but because the margins for error have narrowed. The same intersections now offer fewer choices. A pause that once passed unnoticed lingers half a second too long. A glance held by the wrong person creates a ripple that does not immediately fade. The environment teaches this lesson patiently, without escalation. She learns to measure distance in attention rather than meters. How far a patrol can see. How quickly a question might follow a greeting. Which shopkeepers still look directly at customers, and which keep their eyes trained elsewhere. These observations settle into a private map layered over the visible one, guiding movement more reliably than memory. You can feel how repetition sharpens awareness rather than dulling it. Each familiar route becomes a test of whether yesterday's assumptions still hold. Safety is provisional, renewed only through successful passage. The ordinary demands constant verification. Nothing can be taken for granted, not even habits that once felt automatic. Inside borrowed rooms, time slows further. Waiting becomes active, filled with listening. Footsteps on stairs are counted, then dismissed, then reconsidered. Silence is interpreted as carefully as sound. Objects remain where they were placed, because movement leaves traces that cannot be erased easily. The body adapts again, this time to restraint under exposure. Small discomforts are ignored. Hunger is managed quietly. Pain is acknowledged only when it interferes with function. Endurance here is not heroic. It is practical, focused on maintaining the appearance of ease. Information arrives unevenly, often incomplete. It is weighed, cross-checked, sometimes held without action. Acting too quickly risks attention. Acting too slowly risks irrelevance. The balance between the two becomes a daily negotiation, conducted without words. You notice how relationships shift under this pressure. Familiar faces carry new weight. Trust is recalibrated continuously, not withdrawn, but distributed more narrowly. Proximity becomes meaningful. Distance becomes protective. Even kindness is measured for risk. The streets continue to receive her without comment. They offer no signals of approval or warning. Their neutrality is deceptive. Each successful return reinforces the illusion that nothing has changed, even as the cost of misjudgment rises. The war has fully entered the everyday now. It does not announce itself. It observes. It waits. And in this waiting, the routines that once offered comfort become tools of concealment, worn carefully, repeatedly, until they begin to fray. She moves on again, not toward safety, but deeper into exposure. The ordinary holds, for now, but its grip tightens with each passing day. Ordinary streets, again. The streets receive her as they always have, without acknowledgment. Morning light settles unevenly along the stone, lingering in shallow pools near doorways before slipping away. Shops open with practiced restraint. Windows are wiped clean, not to welcome, but to maintain the appearance of order. Nothing signals change. That, in itself, is the condition. She walks a route she has already walked many times, not because it is optimal, but because it has proven survivable. Familiarity here is not comfort. It is calibration. Each step confirms that yesterday's assumptions still hold, at least for now. You notice how the ordinary continues to demand attention. A cart pauses too long at an intersection. A conversation quiets as she passes. A glance lasts just a fraction longer than necessary. None of this resolves into danger. All of it requires storage. The mind collects these moments without sorting them, aware that meaning may arrive later. Repetition sharpens perception rather than dulling it. The same street does not feel the same from one day to the next. A new notice appears on a wall. A uniform is worn slightly differently. The environment communicates through these minor shifts, offering no explanations, only data. Her body moves with learned restraint. Pace steady. Hands occupied. Breath unremarkable. Movement remains neutral enough to dissolve into the background. The effort required to maintain this neutrality has become routine, though it draws continuously on attention. Inside this repetition, time stretches. Minutes lose distinction. Hours flatten. The day does not build toward anything. It simply persists. This persistence becomes the work itself. You sense how fatigue accumulates quietly here, not through exertion, but through constancy. There is no release, no pause that allows vigilance to drop entirely. Even moments of rest carry a residue of awareness that cannot be dismissed. The streets offer no signal of approval or warning. They accept passage without comment, holding each crossing as provisional. Safety is renewed through repetition alone. She continues, not advancing, not retreating, just moving again, as required. The ordinary holds. For now. By afternoon, the light has shifted enough to change how the streets are read. Shadows stretch longer across the stone, blurring the edges of doorways that felt distinct earlier in the day. The same route now carries a different weight, not because it is more dangerous, but because it must be reassessed under altered conditions. Familiarity does not remove uncertainty. It requires renewal. She passes the same landmarks again, now from the opposite direction. A bench recently empty is occupied. A doorway that once offered concealment stands open. These changes are not dramatic, but they alter the internal map she carries, forcing small adjustments that must remain invisible to anyone watching. You can feel how repetition becomes a form of verification. Each return tests whether yesterday's movements still belong today. What held once may no longer hold. The street teaches this lesson without emphasis, through minor variation rather than interruption. Sound behaves differently as the day advances. Voices rise slightly, then fall. Footsteps multiply, overlapping until individual movement is harder to distinguish. Crowds offer cover, but they also introduce unpredictability. The body adjusts, tightening focus without altering pace. Inside shops and narrow passages, air feels denser. Time slows again, not because of waiting, but because attention must spread across more variables. The effort required to remain unremarkable increases as surroundings grow more active. Neutrality must now be performed with greater care. Fatigue makes itself known in brief moments, an impulse to pause, a desire to shorten the route. These impulses are acknowledged and set aside. Stopping without reason invites interpretation. The day continues because it must. You notice how memory begins to layer. Morning observations remain present, now joined by afternoon ones, forming patterns that cannot yet be interpreted. The mind holds them loosely, aware that premature conclusions create risk. As evening approaches, the streets soften again. Movement thins. Windows glow with contained light. The city exhales without signaling safety. Conditions shift, but do not resolve. She completes the circuit without incident, not because it was safe, but because it was survivable. The return does not mark progress. It confirms continuity. The streets close over her passage once more, unchanged in appearance, altered only by what they have required. Tomorrow they will be read again. Rooms that borrow silence. The rooms are never truly hers. They are lent, tolerated, occupied for a time, and then released back into anonymity. Each one carries the faint imprint of previous lives, furniture arranged for other bodies, windows that open only partway, walls that have absorbed more than they reveal. Silence here is not emptiness, but a shared agreement to leave no mark. She learns each space quickly. Which floorboards complain under weight, which doors swell in damp weather and resist closing, how light moves across the room at different hours, exposing corners that feel safe at night but vulnerable by morning. This knowledge is gathered quietly, without ritual, because repetition itself is the only teacher available. You sense how these rooms compress time. Days pass without reference to calendars. Instead, time is measured through visits that arrive or fail to arrive, through messages delivered late or not at all. Waiting becomes interior, filling the space between breaths, settling into the stillness demanded by borrowed shelter. Outside, the city continues its measured rhythm. Inside, sound becomes the dominant concern. A cough is suppressed. A chair is not moved. Even paper is handled slowly, coaxed into silence rather than folded. The room responds to this discipline by holding together, offering temporary concealment in exchange for restraint. The war presses inward through absence as much as presence. Missing footsteps signal change more clearly than sudden noise. A street that feels too quiet raises questions that cannot be voiced. The environment communicates through subtraction, forcing attention onto what is no longer there. Her body adjusts again, this time to confinement. Muscles stiffen from stillness. Circulation slows. Sleep arrives in fragments, interrupted by the need to remain oriented even in darkness. Rest becomes conditional, something accepted cautiously, aware that it can be withdrawn at any moment. You notice how trust operates differently within these walls. It is not declared or discussed. It is practiced through consistency, arriving when expected, leaving without trace, respecting the room's rules without being told. Trust accumulates slowly, erodes quickly, and is never complete. The borrowed nature of these spaces shapes behavior. Nothing is unpacked fully. Personal items remain minimal, chosen for function rather than comfort. The goal is not to settle, but to pass through without leaving evidence of passage. Belonging would create vulnerability. Information enters these rooms in fragments, often carried by fatigue. Decisions are made with limited clarity, shaped by what is known to be unsafe rather than what appears promising. The room does not offer guidance. It only provides a pause in which to consider the next movement. She waits again, not for instruction, but for conditions to align enough to move without increasing risk. The room holds her still, lending it silence for as long as it can. Outside, the war continues its slow tightening, drawing these hidden spaces closer to its center. As days collect, the rooms begin to feel heavier, not smaller, but denser, as though the air itself has learned to resist movement. Each hour spent within borrowed walls adds a layer of caution that must be carried forward. Silence, once a refuge, becomes a discipline that requires constant maintenance. She notices how the rooms remember. A cup placed on a table leaves a faint ring. A window opened too often loosens its frame. Even careful living creates traces. These signs are studied, corrected, erased where possible. The effort to leave no evidence becomes part of the routine, as essential as breathing. You can sense how waiting here differs from waiting elsewhere. It is not the waiting of anticipation, nor even of uncertainty, but of calculation. Movement is postponed not because it is impossible, but because it is not yet survivable. Time is used to narrow risk, not to eliminate it. Outside sounds filter in unevenly. Voices drift up from the street, distorted by distance and walls. Footsteps pass, sometimes pause, then continue. Each sound is assessed, not for meaning, but for deviation from expectation. Normality, when it appears, is reassuring only until it changes. The body responds to this sustained stillness with subtle rebellion. Joints ache. Circulation slows. Attention drifts and must be brought back deliberately. Fatigue here is quiet, cumulative, and difficult to measure. There are no markers to indicate when endurance has been spent too freely. Trust within these spaces remains provisional. Hosts offer what they can without discussion. Guests accept without gratitude that might linger. Boundaries are understood intuitively, maintained through restraint rather than instruction. The room exists in balance only so long as everyone remembers it is temporary. Information, when it arrives, often brings contradiction. Reports conflict. Routes once reliable become compromised. Names disappear from conversations without explanation. The room absorbs these uncertainties, holding them without comment. Decisions made here carry the weight of incomplete knowledge. You notice how identity thins under these conditions. Roles blur. Days lose distinction. The self becomes oriented around function. What must be done, what must be avoided, what must be endured. Everything else is deferred, set aside for a time that cannot be defined. Eventually, the room releases her, not with ceremony, but through necessity. Remaining still begins to carry more risk than movement. Silence can only be borrowed for so long before it becomes conspicuous. The walls have done what they can. She leaves without altering the space, returning it to the anonymity that protects it. The door closes softly. The street receives her again, unchanged in appearance, altered in consequence. The war continues its quiet work, and the rooms resume their waiting, ready to lend silence to whoever next requires it. Messages that must not linger. Movement resumes cautiously, as if the body itself must be reminded how to travel without drawing attention. Streets that once felt navigable now demand re-evaluation. Corners are approached with deliberate neutrality. Every pause is shortened, every adjustment made to appear incidental. The environment does not resist movement outright, but it no longer forgives it easily. Messages pass through hands that do not keep them long. Paper is folded, unfolded, read once, then reduced to something smaller, lighter, easier to destroy. Words are chosen for efficiency rather than clarity. Ambiguity becomes a safeguard. Meaning is expected to survive loss. She handles these exchanges without emphasis. There is no sense of importance attached to them, no visible care that might suggest value. The message must appear forgettable, something easily displaced by the next errand, the next conversation. Only what is unremarkable remains unexamined. You notice how time compresses around these moments. The act of receiving and passing information occurs quickly, but its implications stretch outward, influencing routes, decisions, absences. Each exchange carries weight far beyond its physical form, yet must be treated as if it carries none at all. The body adapts again, this time to movement under instruction that cannot be acknowledged. Routes are learned through repetition rather than maps. Landmarks become cues rather than destinations. A certain doorway, a stairwell, a bench, each holds significance that cannot be spoken. Fatigue returns in sharper forms. The concentration required to maintain neutrality under motion draws heavily on attention. Small errors threaten to accumulate. Sleep offers little relief, as the mind continues its quiet accounting even at rest. You sense how communication itself has become fragile. The fewer words used, the safer the exchange. Silence fills the gaps, trusted to carry what language cannot. The war has narrowed expression to its most functional core. Each successful passage reinforces the method. Messages that do not linger do not leave traces. Traces attract attention. Attention invites interpretation. Interpretation erodes control. The logic is simple, repeated until it becomes instinctive. She moves on, carrying nothing visible, leaving nothing behind. The streets close over her passage, absorbing it into their ordinary flow. The message is already elsewhere, dissolving into action beyond the reach of those who would trace it. The exchanges begin to repeat with slight variation. Different streets, altered timings, new faces that must be learned quickly and then forgotten just as thoroughly. The pattern holds even as its details shift. Familiarity does not bring comfort. It sharpens awareness of how easily disruption could spread. She notices how the act of carrying information changes posture. Shoulders remain loose, hands occupied with ordinary objects. Nothing is held too carefully. Care itself becomes a liability. The body learns to distribute attention evenly, never allowing any single moment to appear significant. You can feel how the city absorbs these movements. Crowds provide cover, but also unpredictability. A delay caused by nothing more than foot traffic can force an adjustment that ripples outward. Each correction must be made smoothly, without signaling urgency. The city rewards those who appear to belong to its flow. Inside this rhythm, risk becomes abstract. There are no immediate consequences to measure, no visible indicators of success or failure. The absence of interruption is taken as confirmation, though it offers no guarantees. The war teaches patience by withholding feedback. The messages themselves grow smaller. Sometimes they are not written at all, existing only as sequences to be remembered, then dismantled once delivered. Memory replaces paper. The mind becomes a temporary container, expected to empty itself completely at the proper moment. Fatigue deepens again, this time as mental wear. The effort required to remember and then forget leaves a residue that sleep cannot fully clear. Thoughts return uninvited, fragments resurfacing until consciously dismissed. Forgetting becomes work. You notice how trust narrows further. Fewer intermediaries. Shorter chains. Redundancy reduced to minimize exposure. Each refinement improves security while increasing isolation. The network tightens, efficient but fragile, dependent on precision. When an exchange fails to occur, its absence speaks loudly. A missed contact forces reassessment without explanation. Routes are reconsidered. Assumptions quietly revised. The system adapts, absorbing loss without acknowledgement. She continues, neither accelerating nor retreating. The work does not escalate. It accumulates. Each successful delivery reinforces the discipline that makes the next one possible. There is no sense of progress, only continuation. The messages move on, dispersing into actions that will never be traced back to these brief moments of transfer. The streets remain unchanged. The war advances invisibly, carried forward by words that refuse to linger. Networks that tighten. The connections between people become harder to see. What once felt like a web now resembles a series of narrow threads, each one stretched carefully to avoid strain. Meetings are shorter. Routes overlap less. Familiar names disappear from circulation without explanation. The network does not announce these changes. It absorbs them. She notices the shift first in tone. Conversations grow more restrained, even when words remain the same. Instructions are delivered without elaboration. Questions are discouraged not through refusal, but through silence. The environment has learned that clarity can create vulnerability. You sense how pressure accumulates not from a single source, but from everywhere at once. Patrols appear slightly more often. Paperwork changes hands with greater caution. Ordinary encounters carry a faint edge, as if everyone is listening for something that may or may not arrive. The city tightens without visibly moving. Repetition, once protective, begins to erode safety. Familiarity makes patterns legible. Routes that worked before now feel exposed. The mind must continually revise its assumptions, abandoning habits that once offered comfort. Adaptation becomes constant rather than periodic. Inside borrowed spaces, decisions are made more quickly. Time for deliberation shrinks. Information arrives incomplete and must be acted upon regardless. The luxury of certainty disappears. Choices are evaluated not by their promise, but by their immediacy. The body responds with quiet strain. Muscles hold tension longer. Breath remains shallow even at rest. Sleep fragments further, interrupted by the need to remain oriented. Fatigue here is no longer background noise. It becomes part of the calculation. You notice how trust is redistributed rather than withdrawn. Fewer people know more. More people know less. This narrowing protects the whole while isolating its parts. Each participant carries only what is necessary, unaware of the full shape of the effort. The war's presence is felt in absences. A cafe closed without explanation. A door that no longer opens. A voice missing from the background of familiar streets. These gaps speak of pressure applied elsewhere, of consequences unfolding beyond view. She continues to move within this tightening field, adjusting to constraints that shift daily. The work no longer feels provisional. It feels finite, as though the margin for error is being slowly consumed. The network holds, for now, through discipline and restraint. but its elasticity is diminishing. Each thread pulled taut leaves less room for recovery. The city watches itself more closely, and beneath the surface, something prepares to give. The tightening continues without a clear moment of escalation. There is no announcement, no single incident that explains the shift. Instead, pressure becomes ambient, settling into every exchange, every movement, every pause between decisions. The environment feels less forgiving, as though it has learned from past leniencies. She senses the narrowing most clearly in the way time behaves. Tasks that once unfolded across days now demand resolution within hours. Delays attract attention. Hesitation creates exposure. The network no longer allows for redundancy. Efficiency becomes the priority, even when it increases risk. You can feel how the city responds to this change. Streets empty earlier. Voices lower more quickly. Windows close sooner in the evening. These adjustments appear voluntary, but they carry the weight of instruction. Everyone understands that visibility has become dangerous. Inside meeting places, the air grows dense with unspoken understanding. Plans are outlined briefly, stripped of narrative. There is no space for reassurance. Each person absorbs what they need to know and leaves without discussion. The goal is not confidence, but containment. The body bears the cost of this compression. Endurance shifts from sustained vigilance to acute alertness. Muscles tighten reflexively. Small pains are ignored, folded into the larger requirement to remain functional. Rest becomes opportunistic, taken wherever the environment allows. You notice how trust now depends on absence rather than presence. The fewer encounters required, the safer the exchange. Familiarity is replaced by distance. Even successful coordination leaves a residue of unease, a sense that visibility itself has become a liability. Loss begins to register indirectly, not through confirmation, but through adjustment. A route removed from use. A contact no longer mentioned. The network responds by contracting further, redistributing responsibilities without acknowledgement. Grief, if it exists, is deferred. She adapts again, refining movements, narrowing focus. The work continues, but its texture has changed. What once felt like careful navigation now resembles passage through a corridor that is slowly closing. Each step forward consumes the space behind. The city offers no signal that this tightening will stop. The war does not need to intervene directly. It relies on accumulation, of pressure, of fear, of necessity. The network holds together through discipline, but the cost of holding rises with each passing day. Eventually, the question is no longer how to continue, but how long continuation remains possible. The answer does not arrive. Instead, the environment insists on further adjustment, pressing inward until movement itself becomes an act of endurance. The body as constraint. Movement begins to register first in the body, before it is acknowledged by thought. The ground feels less forgiving. Steps require slightly more calculation. Balance is adjusted without conscious effort, learned through repetition rather than instruction. The environment does not change its expectations. It assumes function without accommodation. She becomes acutely aware of how the body occupies space. Doorways are measured carefully. Stairs are approached with attention to rhythm. Fatigue settles unevenly, collecting in places that must be protected because they cannot be ignored. The body is no longer simply present. It is a variable. You notice how this awareness reshapes movement. Routes are selected not only for safety, but for sustainability. A longer path may be chosen if it offers steadier footing. A brief pause becomes necessary, then must be concealed within ordinary behavior. The war allows no exemption for limitation. Inside rooms meant for rest, the body does not fully release its vigilance. Muscles remain partially engaged. Breathing stays shallow until consciously slowed. Pain is acknowledged quietly, assessed for impact rather than comfort. The question is never how it feels, but whether it interferes. The environment responds indifferently. Streets do not adjust their pace. Schedules do not bend. The system has no capacity for variance. It operates on assumptions of uniformity. To remain within it, adaptation must occur privately, without visible request. You sense how endurance here differs from earlier forms. It is no longer only mental or emotional, but physical in ways that cannot be deferred. The body carries memory forward, storing strain accumulated over weeks of controlled movement and constrained rest. Observation turns inward as well as outward. Signals are monitored closely. A twinge, a delay in response, a shift in balance. Each becomes data to be evaluated. Adjustments are made quietly, integrated into routine before they can draw notice. The war presses without regard for embodiment. Its demands are constant, its tempo unyielding. The body learns to negotiate with itself, trading comfort for continuity, ease for control. This negotiation is ongoing, without resolution. She continues, not because the body permits it easily, but because stopping would require explanation. Explanation invites attention. Attention erodes concealment. The calculus remains unchanged. The streets accept her passage as before, offering no acknowledgement of the additional effort required. To the environment, movement remains movement. The cost of maintaining it is borne privately, carried forward step by step. Over time, the body develops its own routines of compensation. Weight shifts subtly. Movements are planned one step ahead. The pace remains outwardly consistent, even as effort increases beneath the surface. What appears smooth has been rehearsed through necessity rather than choice. She notices how attention narrows around physical thresholds. How far she can walk before strain appears. How long she can stand without adjusting posture. These limits are not fixed. They vary with fatigue, weather, and the accumulation of previous days. Each morning begins with quiet assessment, performed without ceremony. You can feel how this vigilance coexists with the demands of concealment. Any pause must be disguised as normal behavior. Any adjustment folded into routine. The body is allowed no visible negotiation. Pain, when it asserts itself, must do so privately. The environment offers no relief. Streets remain uneven. Buildings demand stairs. Schedules assume endurance. There is no space for exception. To remain within the flow, the body must continually renegotiate its own capacity without signaling change. Fatigue becomes layered. The earlier exhaustion of waiting and vigilance now carries a physical weight that does not dissipate overnight. Rest reduces its edge, but never clears it entirely. The body learns to operate under partial recovery, accepting a diminished baseline as normal. You notice how this affects decision-making. Routes are chosen with increasing care. Tasks are sequenced to conserve strength. Moments of relative ease are used strategically, not enjoyed. The margin for error narrows further. Inside borrowed rooms, the body's presence is felt more distinctly. Stillness amplifies discomfort. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow and fragmented, interrupted by the need to maintain readiness even in repose. Dreams reflect this constraint, replaying ordinary movements with heightened effort. The war continues to demand movement regardless. Its pressures do not adjust for fatigue. Its systems do not register strain unless it produces visible failure. To remain invisible, failure must be avoided. She adapts again, integrating limitation into method. What cannot be changed is managed. What cannot be eased is endured. This adaptation does not announce itself. It simply becomes part of how movement occurs. The streets receive her passage without distinction. They do not mark the additional cost. They do not register endurance. They only register continuity. And continuity, here, remains the primary requirement. Borders that narrow. The edges of the world begin to assert themselves more clearly, not as lines on maps, but as thresholds that must be crossed with care. Rivers are no longer scenery. Hills are no longer distance. Each boundary carries its own logic, enforced unevenly, unpredictably, by people who interpret rules rather than apply them. She approaches these margins with the same restraint learned elsewhere. There is no visible preparation, no outward acknowledgement of transition. Movement remains measured. Breath is controlled. The body carries forward its private calculations, adjusting to terrain that demands effort without offering certainty. You notice how space itself feels compressed here. Paths narrow. Cover becomes intermittent. The landscape offers fewer places to pause without consequence. Each step forward reduces the number of options behind. The war does not need walls to limit movement. It relies on exposure. The rhythm of travel changes. Progress is slower, governed by conditions rather than intent. Weather intrudes without negotiation. Ground shifts underfoot, demanding attention that cannot be spared elsewhere. The body responds by tightening focus, conserving energy for what cannot be deferred. Waiting returns, but in altered form. Not the waiting of rooms or offices, but of open ground where stillness is visible. Pauses are chosen carefully, time to blend with natural interruption, wind through grass, the passing of animals, the gradual change of light. Even the landscape must be read for permission. Fatigue deepens as terrain resists familiarity. Muscles are taxed unevenly. Balance requires constant correction. The body's earlier adaptations are tested here, pushed closer to their limits by distance and exposure. There is no space for adjustment without consequence. You can feel how identity thins further at these margins. There are no roles to perform, no routines to rely upon. Movement becomes purely functional, stripped of pretense. Survival depends on alignment with environment rather than system. The war's presence is felt indirectly, not through patrols alone, but through the knowledge that crossing itself is an act of visibility. Each border carries the memory of others who failed to pass. This knowledge settles quietly, informing pace and posture without needing to be named. She continues forward, not because the path is clear, but because remaining still offers no advantage. The border does not announce its acceptance. It allows passage or it does not. There is no negotiation. The landscape closes behind her as it always does, leaving no sign of crossing. Ahead, the terrain remains uncertain. The war tightens its grip not through force alone, but through the gradual narrowing of space in which movement remains possible. As movement continues, the landscape begins to impose its own rhythm. Progress is measured not by distance covered, but by how well effort is conserved. Each incline demands calculation. Each descent requires restraint. The body adjusts constantly, responding to terrain that offers no consistency from one step to the next. She learns to read the ground as carefully as she once read rooms. Loose stone signals caution. Damp earth suggests delay. Grass flattened in unfamiliar patterns invites reconsideration. These signs are interpreted quickly, absorbed without analysis, because hesitation itself can become visible. You notice how time behaves differently here. Hours stretch without markers. Light shifts gradually, altering perception without warning. The absence of clocks forces reliance on internal cues: fatigue, hunger, the changing quality of air. Decisions must be made without reference points that once provided reassurance. Waiting returns again, but now it is exposed. There are moments when stillness is required, when movement would draw attention from a distance too great to measure. In these pauses, the body holds itself in balance, resisting the urge to settle, aware that settling would cost more energy than remaining poised. The environment offers no shelter that does not also demand compromise. Trees provide cover but restrict movement. Rocks offer concealment but punish stillness. Each choice trades one risk for another. There is no correct option, only tolerable ones. Fatigue becomes immediate, physical, undeniable. Muscles tremble under load. Breath shortens despite effort to control it. The body's earlier strategies are tested and adjusted again, stripped to their essentials. Endurance here is not about persistence over time, but about managing the present moment without collapse. You can feel how isolation deepens. There are no familiar cues, no shared routines. The self becomes reduced to function. Move, stop, listen, continue. Everything else recedes, deferred until the environment loosens its grip. The war remains present even in apparent emptiness. Its influence is carried in the knowledge of observation, in the awareness that exposure can occur without warning. Borders are enforced not only by people, but by the understanding that certain movements invite scrutiny. She continues through this narrowing space, guided by restraint rather than confidence. Each successful passage does not bring relief, only the requirement to maintain vigilance a little longer. The border does not end cleanly. It fades, giving way to another margin, another set of constraints. The landscape absorbs her movement without acknowledgement. No trace remains to mark the crossing. Behind her, the path closes. Ahead, uncertainty persists, stretching outward with the same quiet insistence as before. Disappearance as method. After the border, the absence of pursuit does not bring relief. It introduces a different pressure, one shaped by uncertainty rather than threat. The landscape opens slightly, but the habits formed under compression do not release their hold. Movement remains careful. Attention stays distributed. The body does not yet trust the widening space. She becomes aware of how completely visibility has defined the previous months. Now, the task is not to pass unnoticed, but to dissolve, to reduce presence until it no longer registers as movement at all. Disappearance is not an event. It is a process, assembled through restraint. You notice how identity thins further here. Names lose relevance. Documents are handled less often. The self becomes situational, defined by where it can remain without consequence. The goal is not to arrive, but to avoid being traced backward. The environment participates in this erasure. Paths are chosen that do not repeat. Shelter is temporary, chosen for anonymity rather than comfort. Even rest is adjusted, taken in places where its absence would not be noticed. Continuity becomes a liability. Fatigue settles differently now. The strain of constant exposure has eased, but it is replaced by a quieter exhaustion, the effort required to remain unanchored. Without routine, the body must renegotiate its rhythms daily. Sleep arrives unpredictably. Hunger is managed without schedule. You can feel how memory itself becomes dangerous. Details that once mattered must be released deliberately. Faces, routes, sequences, these are not preserved, but dismantled. Forgetting is no longer incidental. It is practiced with intention. The war continues elsewhere, loud and unresolved, but here it recedes into background noise. Its influence remains present through consequence rather than immediacy. Decisions made months earlier still shape what is possible now. Disappearance does not erase responsibility. It suspends it. She adjusts to this state gradually. Movement becomes less frequent, more deliberate. The body carries fewer objects. The mind carries fewer plans. Existence narrows to what can be sustained without attracting attention. You sense how this form of endurance differs from what came before. It is not resistance, not escape, but maintenance. Remaining absent long enough for systems to lose interest. Allowing pressure to redirect elsewhere. The landscape holds her without recognition. It neither conceals nor exposes deliberately. It simply remains, indifferent to intention. Within this indifference, disappearance becomes viable, sustained through patience rather than motion. The days that follow do not arrange themselves into sequence. Without routine, time loosens its grip, stretching and contracting unpredictably. Morning arrives without ceremony. Evening follows without closure. The body adapts by releasing expectation, learning to exist within intervals rather than schedules. She notices how sound behaves differently in this state. Footsteps are rare. Voices carry farther than expected. Even wind through trees feels amplified, as if the absence of constant noise has sharpened perception. Each sound is registered, then allowed to pass without interpretation unless it demands one. You can sense how vigilance transforms again. It is no longer acute or reactive, but diffuse. Attention settles into the background, always present, never fully engaged. This posture allows endurance without exhaustion, a form of watchfulness that does not announce itself. Identity continues to erode in practical ways. Clothing is chosen for neutrality rather than expression. Possessions are reduced to what can be carried without thought. The self becomes defined by function alone, unburdened by markers that invite recognition. The war's reach remains indirect. Its consequences arrive through scarcity, through altered movement of others, through the knowledge that certain names and places can no longer be revisited. Even in absence, pressure persists, shaping decisions without appearing directly. Fatigue lingers, but it is quieter now. The body no longer strains against constant movement or concealment. Instead, it manages a steady, low demand, remaining available to move if required, remaining still if that is safer. Rest is taken cautiously, without surrender. You notice how memory fades selectively. Some details dissolve on their own. Others must be released deliberately. Holding too much risks reattachment, and reattachment invites traceability. Forgetting becomes a form of discipline, practiced without sentiment. Over time, the sense of being pursued diminishes, replaced by a more ambiguous awareness. The absence of threat does not guarantee safety. It only suggests that attention has shifted elsewhere. This knowledge prevents complacency. She remains within this suspended state, neither advancing nor retreating. The goal is not resolution, but persistence. To remain unremarkable long enough for systems to recalibrate, for pressure to diffuse. The landscape accepts this quiet presence without acknowledgement. Paths remain open, then close again. Shelter appears, then disappears. Nothing signals completion. Disappearance, sustained over time, becomes its own method of survival. Return without recognition. Movement resumes gradually, not with confidence, but with caution shaped by habit. The world has not changed in appearance. Roads still follow familiar lines. Buildings stand where they always have. Yet the conditions governing passage feel altered, as though the environment remembers pressure even after it has eased. She re-enters spaces that once demanded concealment, now offering a different kind of uncertainty. The absence of immediate threat does not translate into safety. It introduces ambiguity. Attention must still be measured. Visibility remains something to be managed rather than assumed. You notice how return differs from arrival. There is no sense of crossing a threshold back into clarity. Instead, the transition unfolds slowly, marked by tentative steps and constant reassessment. What was once routine must be relearned. The body tests limits carefully, gauging whether old habits remain viable. The war's presence has shifted. Its sound is more distant, its movements less concentrated. Yet its systems persist, altered but intact. Bureaucracy resumes its work. Documents circulate again. Categories are revised, not dismantled. The machinery that once excluded has not disappeared. It has merely adjusted its focus. Fatigue surfaces in unexpected ways. The body, having adapted to absence, now resists re-engagement. Muscles tighten in anticipation of pressure that does not immediately arrive. Restlessness replaces vigilance. Sleep remains light, shaped by uncertainty rather than threat. You can feel how recognition fails to materialize. There are no acknowledgments, no formal closures. The work done in concealment leaves no visible trace. Its success is measured only by what did not occur. This absence of consequence is both protection and erasure. Identity, already thinned by disappearance, does not immediately reassemble. Roles must be reclaimed cautiously, if at all. Names are spoken again, but without emphasis. The self returns incrementally, shaped by what can be sustained without drawing attention. The environment offers no guidance for this transition. Streets remain indifferent. Offices resume their routines. The war moves toward resolution elsewhere, but here, its residue lingers in process rather than event. She continues forward, navigating a landscape that no longer requires disappearance but does not yet permit ease. The habits learned under pressure remain intact, shaping movement even when conditions appear relaxed. Return, it becomes clear, is not an endpoint. It is another state to be endured, defined by uncertainty rather than danger. Recognition is neither expected nor required. Survival, once achieved, must now be maintained within systems that do not remember its cost. The routines of ordinary life begin to reassert themselves, but they do so unevenly, without coherence. Some gestures come back easily, the rhythm of walking through familiar streets, the instinctive reading of faces, the ability to pause without calculating consequence. Others resist return, remaining bound to conditions that no longer fully apply. She notices how spaces feel exposed now, not because of threat, but because concealment has shaped perception for too long. Open rooms feel unfinished. Conversations held at normal volume carry an unfamiliar weight. The absence of caution feels louder than danger ever did. You can sense how systems resume their work with quiet efficiency. Papers move through hands again. Decisions are made and recorded. The processes that once delayed and excluded now proceed without reference to what occurred beyond their reach. Continuity is restored not by remembering, but by ignoring interruption. Fatigue lingers in subtle forms. Not the exhaustion of exertion, nor the strain of vigilance, but a residual weariness born of prolonged adaptation. The body, accustomed to operating under constraint, does not immediately accept ease. Muscles remain poised. Breath remains measured. Recognition, when it fails to appear, does not arrive as disappointment. It arrives as confirmation. The absence of acknowledgement reinforces what has already been learned, that survival within systems rarely produces visible trace. What remains undocumented might as well have not occurred. Identity continues to assemble slowly. Some elements return easily. Others remain suspended, perhaps permanently altered by absence. The self that re-emerges is quieter, shaped less by intention than by endurance. There is no moment of reintegration, only gradual accommodation. You notice how memory behaves differently now. Certain details return unbidden. Others remain inaccessible, sealed away by necessity. The effort required to recall feels heavier than the effort required to forget. Time has rearranged what can be carried forward. The war moves toward its conclusion elsewhere, but here its influence persists through habit. The learned behaviors, restraint, observation, patience, do not dissolve simply because pressure has eased. They remain available, ready to reassert themselves if required. She continues within this unresolved state, neither celebrated nor condemned. The work recedes into invisibility, absorbed into outcomes that cannot be traced back to their origin. Return, stripped of recognition, becomes another form of disappearance. The environment accepts this quietly. Streets remain open. Offices continue their measured operations. Life resumes without adjustment for what has passed through it unseen. After the pressure lifts. The end of the war does not arrive all at once. It disperses unevenly, carried by announcements that reach some places sooner than others, by celebrations that feel distant even when they occur nearby. For those who have lived inside sustained pressure, release does not announce itself clearly. It must be learned, cautiously, over time. She observes the change rather than stepping into it. Flags appear where none hung before. Voices grow louder in the streets. Movement accelerates, shedding the restraint that once governed every step. Yet the body does not respond immediately. Habits formed under constraint remain in place, shaping reaction long after their necessity has passed. You notice how relief behaves here, not as joy, but as absence. The removal of constant vigilance leaves a space that must be filled slowly. Without the demand to monitor every detail, attention drifts, then returns, uncertain of its role. The mind continues to scan for pressure that no longer arrives. Systems resume their authority with remarkable speed. Offices reopen. Procedures are reinstated. Documentation is updated to reflect new realities. What occurred beyond official channels does not factor into these adjustments. The machinery moves forward without pausing to account for what passed through it unseen. Fatigue surfaces in unexpected waves. With pressure lifted, the body allows itself to feel what it had deferred. Weariness settles deeply, no longer moderated by necessity. Rest becomes possible, but it arrives unevenly, interrupted by reflexes that have not yet released their hold. You can sense how memory reorganizes itself during this period. Events that once demanded constant attention begin to blur. Others sharpen unexpectedly, resurfacing without warning. The mind tests which experiences can be integrated and which remain unresolved. Recognition, when it comes, arrives slowly and selectively. It is mediated by institutions that prefer clarity over ambiguity. Contributions that do not fit established categories are acknowledged cautiously, if at all. Absence of record complicates acknowledgement. What cannot be documented struggles to be affirmed. She moves through this landscape of partial release without expectation. The war's end does not restore what was set aside. It alters conditions, but it does not reverse adaptation. The self that remains has been shaped by endurance rather than outcome. The world adjusts around her, returning to rhythms that feel unfamiliar. The quiet pressure that once defined daily life recedes, but its imprint persists, influencing perception long after its source has vanished. As days pass, the absence of urgency becomes more pronounced. Time stretches without resistance. Mornings arrive without instruction. Evenings settle without the need for calculation. For those who have lived within compression, this openness feels unstructured, almost provisional, as though it might be withdrawn without warning. She begins to notice how the body negotiates this change. Muscles release unevenly. Posture softens in moments, then tightens again without cause. Breathing deepens, then shallows when a sound arrives unexpectedly. The body tests safety in increments, uncertain how long it will hold. You can feel how attention recalibrates. The constant outward scanning recedes, replaced by quieter observation. Details once monitored for threat now register simply as presence: light through windows, the weight of air, the ordinary movement of others. The shift is subtle, unfolding without announcement. Institutions continue their work, now framed as restoration. Records are formalized. Boundaries are redrawn. What occurred outside official channels remains peripheral, difficult to place within narratives designed for resolution. The war concludes on paper more easily than it does in memory. Fatigue continues to surface in waves. Without the structure of necessity, rest becomes deeper but less predictable. Sleep carries remnants of earlier vigilance, though its intensity fades. The body gradually relearns how to be still without listening. Recognition, when it appears, does so unevenly. It is filtered through systems that value documentation over experience. The absence of trace complicates inclusion. What survives without record resists easy acknowledgement. For many, this omission confirms what was already understood, that invisibility, once required, lingers beyond its usefulness. Identity adjusts again, assembling around what remains rather than what has ended. Certain roles fall away naturally, others persist out of habit. The self does not return to a previous form. It settles into something quieter, shaped by adaptation rather than closure. Much later, when records are finally aligned with absence, her name will appear in them: Virginia Hall, attached quietly to work that was never meant to be seen. You notice how the environment absorbs this transition without comment. Streets fill and empty. Buildings resume their functions. Life proceeds, indifferent to the personal recalibrations occurring within it. The war recedes into history, but its imprint remains distributed unevenly across those who endured it. She continues forward, carrying no markers of distinction. The pressure has lifted, but the lessons remain. Endurance, once demanded, now becomes memory, and memory, unlike threat, does not require constant attention to persist. With distance from the war comes a different kind of silence, not the enforced quiet of concealment, nor the borrowed stillness of waiting rooms, but the absence left behind when pressure withdraws. This silence does not demand discipline. It offers no instruction. It simply exists, expansive and unresolved. She moves within this space without urgency. Days no longer require calibration against risk. Movement unfolds according to convenience rather than calculation. Yet the habits formed under constraint do not dissolve easily. Attention still lingers on thresholds. Pauses still arrive measured, as if consequence might return. You notice how memory settles unevenly. Certain moments surface with clarity, the texture of paper handled too often, the weight of doors closing softly, the rhythm of footsteps that once required adjustment. Other stretches dissolve entirely, compressed into an indistinct sense of duration without detail. The mind preserves what was repeated most often. Institutions finalize their accounts. Reports are written. Archives are assembled. The war becomes something that can be referenced, categorized, concluded. What remains unmarked does not disrupt this process. Absence is easier to manage than ambiguity. Fatigue takes on its final form here. No longer acute, no longer cumulative, but residual. A low presence carried forward without demand. It does not interfere with function. It shapes it quietly, guiding choices toward restraint even when restraint is no longer required. You can feel how endurance transforms into disposition. The patience once necessary becomes habitual. The reluctance to draw attention persists as preference rather than strategy. These traits no longer protect against danger. They simply remain. Recognition, if it comes, arrives filtered through time. It is retrospective, measured, often incomplete. It attempts to affix names and meanings to actions that were designed to leave none. The fit is imperfect. What was lived resists summary. She does not contest this. There is no need to correct the record. Survival did not depend on acknowledgement, and memory does not require validation to persist. What remains unmarked retains its quiet integrity. The environment absorbs this state without resistance. Light continues to move across familiar surfaces. Seasons change. The war recedes further into abstraction. What endures does so without monument, carried within habits that no longer announce their origin. Time settles into a steady cadence. Days follow one another without distinction strong enough to require memory. The absence of pressure allows life to resume its ordinary pace, yet the imprint of endurance remains visible in small choices, routes preferred for their quiet, rooms selected for their corners, moments of stillness taken without explanation. She notices how attention now moves outward again, no longer fixed on threat but on texture. Light through a window becomes something to observe rather than evaluate. Sound arrives without demand. The body responds gradually, accepting ease in fragments rather than all at once. You sense how forgetting continues its work. Details once held tightly dissolve without effort. The mind releases them not as loss, but as completion. What mattered for survival no longer needs preservation. What remains does so because repetition etched it deeper than intention could. Institutions complete their narratives. Dates are fixed. Outcomes summarized. The war becomes a sequence rather than an atmosphere. In this ordering, gaps persist, places where lived experience resists insertion. These gaps are not errors. They are the consequence of actions taken to avoid trace. Fatigue finally loosens its hold. Not entirely, but enough to allow rest without vigilance. Sleep deepens. The body's earlier negotiations with itself recede into background function. Endurance becomes memory rather than requirement. You notice how identity stabilizes into something quieter than before. It is not defined by role or recognition, but by what can be carried without effort. The self does not announce what it has endured. It simply continues. The environment remains indifferent, as it always has. Streets accommodate movement without inquiry. Buildings hold their routines. The world does not pause to acknowledge what passed through it unseen. What remains unmarked persists precisely because it was never meant to be recorded. Its influence is distributed across habits, preferences, and the quiet competence of continuing without display. She moves forward within this ordinary landscape, unremarkable by design. The war has ended, but its lessons remain embedded where they do not require attention. Silence, once borrowed, now belongs to no one. When silence is no longer borrowed, the present returns quietly, not as a moment, but as a condition. Wind moves through open space without being measured. Light settles where it will, unconcerned with concealment. The world no longer requires adjustment to pass through it, and yet the habit of adjustment lingers, softened but intact. You can sense how silence has changed its meaning. Once borrowed, rationed, protected, it now arrives freely. It does not need to be maintained. It does not demand discipline. It exists as background rather than shield. And in this ease, its earlier weight becomes visible only in memory. What endures is not a sequence of events, nor a record that can be consulted. It is a posture toward the world shaped by endurance rather than recognition, a way of moving that favors restraint even when it is no longer necessary, a patience learned through repetition that does not dissolve simply because pressure has lifted. The war has receded into dates and summaries, into archives and conclusions. Its machinery has shut down or transformed, but the habits it produced remain distributed across those who lived within it. These habits do not announce themselves. They do not seek validation. They simply persist, quiet and functional. You notice how the landscape holds this without acknowledgement. Paths remain open. Rooms accept presence without question. The ordinary continues, indifferent to what once passed through it unseen. This indifference is not dismissal. It is continuity. There is no final accounting here. No balance restored. Survival does not require resolution, only duration. What was learned under pressure becomes part of how life is carried forward, shaping choices that no longer feel strategic, only natural. Silence, now unclaimed, moves freely again. It belongs to no system, no necessity. And in that freedom, it carries a faint trace of what it once protected, an echo that does not demand attention, but remains available to those who pause long enough to listen. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.